Hey, good evening. My name is Aaron Duke. This is my video presentation for CPSC 4730. I'm going to be giving a critical analysis of the European Union's Digital Services Act, um, which is a Digital Services Act, or the DSA, is a piece of legislation that came into effect in 2022 and became fully applicable across the European Union in 2024. It was introduced as the most comprehensive piece of internet regulation ever enacted. And it was enacted under the guise that it would make the internet safer and would protect users from harmful content, and it would hold big tech companies accountable, which are all admirable goals. We all want a safer internet, and we all want protections against harmful material. Um, Although, uh, when we take a deeper look at the framework of the law itself, we see that it threatens some fundamental freedoms that we have right now on the online, some fundamental online freedoms. So, what does this law do? It applies to what the EU calls digital services, which are essentially any online platform, from social media giants to small chat forums to cloud services. Although the larger the platform, the more obligations it faces. So unlike the DSA platforms are under the DSA, um, platforms are required to quickly remove what's classified as illegal content. They must implement systems for users to report content, and they have to respond rapidly to these reports. Very large online platforms, those with over 45 million users, face even stricter requirements. They must conduct risk assessments, implement mitigation measures, and submit to external audits. And in these audits, they're required to provide transparency reports about their content moderation decisions, and they must give researchers access to all their data. So, on the surface, this might sound reasonable, because shouldn't platforms remove illegal content? Shouldn't they be transparent? But the devil is in the details. And as I kind of peel the layers of the onion back here, you will see that some troubling details or troubling picture starts to emerge. So let's begin with the most obvious problem, that the Digital Services Act has created a vast infrastructure for mass censorship. Um, it requires platforms to remove illegal content quickly, often within hours of being notified. So, what is illegal and who decides what's illegal? Um, well, we would think that that answer is decided by courts through established legal precedent with due process, but that's not how it works in practice. That's not how it's worked at all. Instead, what's occurred is these online platforms motivated by fear of massive fines that can reach up to 6% of their global revenue. They've begun to err heavily on the side of removal, because they can't risk waiting for a court to decide what is truly illegal. They can't afford the potential fines, so they remove content and they ask questions later. So this has created a very chilling effect across users for users across the EU, because they know that their speech can be removed at any moment without any ability to appeal, and so they start self-censoring, and they think twice before ever expressing a controversial opinion, and that's what we're seeing across Europe right now. Um, and like I said earlier, we talked about, well, who decides what's illegal. Well, what do they use to define illegal content? And you would think it would be clearly defined, but it's not. Um, Different EU member states have different laws about what constitutes illegal speech, and the DSA requires the online platforms to comply with all of these national laws simultaneously. Um, this has created what legal scholars have called a lowering of the bar, where the most restrictive speech laws have effectively become the standard for all of Europe. So, what does this mean in practice? You could have a user in Poland make a statement online that's completely legal in Poland, but their content's removed because it violates German law. Or a French comic who makes a joke in France that's completely acceptable, who is silenced and censored because their joke has offended the sensibilities of someone in Austria. It's created a system where the most censorious nation sets the precedent for everyone across the European Union. So, what happens when a government decides that criticism of its policies constitutes disinformation or poses a threat to public order? Well, under the DSA framework, they have the tools to silence that criticism at scale. What happens when a future government less concerned with our democratic norms uses these powers to suppress opposition voices or journalists or whistleblowers? As a matter of fact, researchers created a thought study at the Georgetown University School of Law, where they created something they asked a question, and they called it the Putin test, where the question said, if an authoritarian leader such as Vladimir Putin were to get their hands on the DSA, what would be the result? Well, they all unanimously came to the same conclusion, that this would lead to widespread authoritarian control of the internet. Because the underlying mechanisms within the Digital Services Act make it such that one person or one government can have this kind of power, which is terrifying. And you might think this is hypothetical, but we're already seeing warning signs across Europe of this. Governments are expanding their definitions of harmful content. They're pressuring platforms to be more proactive in content moderation. They're using the DSA's transparency requirements not to hold platforms accountable, but to monitor and influence what people say online. So the DSA has essentially deputized private companies to act as speech police on behalf of these state actors or governments. And the scary part is these governments are not bound by any constitutional protections or accountability in the same way governments are. They make decisions in boardrooms behind closed doors based on, opaque algorithms and policies that change at the drop of a dime. And yet they wield enormous power over online discourse. And this power has been legitimized by the DSA. This is incredibly dangerous because it completely circumvents our traditional safeguards that have been put into place and built into our democratic systems. When a government wants to restrict speech, traditionally it has to go through a legislative process, and there's judicial or governmental checks and balances. But the DSA allows for content removal that skips all of that, which has created essentially a back door for government control of online speech. And that was one of the take-home points of that study that I referenced earlier at Georgetown School of Law. Another deeply troubling aspect of the Digital Services Act, outside of the illegal content moderation and the authoritarian toolkit that it has enabled, is its implication for privacy and surveillance. The DSA requires platforms, particularly very large platforms, to keep vast amounts of data about their users and their content moderation decisions. And this data has to be made available to regulators, and as I said earlier, to researchers too, if they're audited. And data retention, we might think of it as a boring technical requirement, but it's actually one of the more invasive aspects of this law. Platforms have to keep records of what content was flagged, by whom, what actions were taken, and why. They must track behavior, document this behavior, and then maintain detailed logs of their algorithmic decision-making processes. This all creates enormous databases of information about people's behavior online, what they're saying, what they're doing, how they interact. And all of this information is accessible to government authorities. So what does this mean for uh, dissidents or journalists or activists? People who or anyone else who might want to have a reason to want their online activity to remain private. Well, the DSA has created a surveillance infrastructure that tracks and records them. Not just them, but public discourse across the entire EU, which realistically, if put in the wrong hands, would be global at a global scale. Um, so even if you trust your current government not to abuse this information, can you trust every future government? And can you trust every government official in your current government not to abuse these databases? History teaches us that surveillance powers, granted for one purpose, are inevitably used for others. We found this out the hard way in the US with the surveillance state that was enacted after 9/11. Just go read up on Edward Snowden if you're not familiar with that. And the problem is when these surveillance apparatuses are put into place, they're incredibly difficult to dismantle. Again, we have witnessed that in our own country. So, and also, this isn't just about government surveillance. The DSA requires platforms themselves to engage in more intensive monitoring of user activity, not just for the governments, but they have to do it themselves in order to comply with their DSA's obligations to detect and remove illegal content. They have to scan, analyze, and categorize every bit of user generated data. What this means is more algorithmic surveillance, more automated content moderation, and more invasive monitoring of everything we do online. So the chilling effect is obvious when people know they're being watched, when they know their every post, comment, or share is being logged and analyzed. They change their behavior. They self-censor. They avoid controversial topics. They abandon public discourse altogether, and our society suffers as a result. So all of this, the censorship infrastructure, the authoritarian toolbox, the surveillance requirements, adds up to something truly alarming. There is a fundamental threat to free expression in Europe. The Digital Services Act, despite its lofty intentions, has made it harder for Europeans to speak freely online. And we're already seeing the effects. Platforms are removing more content than ever before, often without any clear justification. Users are reporting that their posts disappear without explanation, that their accounts are suspended for unclear violations, and that they're unable to appeal. Users themselves are reporting that they are self-censoring. Small platforms unable to afford the cost of compliance, they just block users all out entirely, or they just shut down altogether. Meanwhile, the larger platforms remaining are becoming more cautious, more conservative in what they allow. They're implementing very restrictive content policies, not because their users demand it, but because the legal risks of not complying are great. They're far too great. So the diverse, vibrant, sometimes chaotic diversity of conversation or discourse online is being washed out and replaced with a sanitized, controlled environment where only safe, approved speech is welcome. This isn't just bad for individual freedom; it's bad for society and democracy itself. Our societies depend on robust public conversation. We need the freedoms and spaces to be able to debate controversial ideas and challenge prevailing ideals and push boundaries. That's how we progress. That's how we identify and correct our wrongs, and that's how our society stays healthy. The Digital Services Act threatens all of this. by creating legal and economic incentives for platforms to suppress speech, by giving governments powerful tools to control online conversation, and by building powerful and very large, thorough surveillance mechanisms that monitors everything we say and do. It's fundamentally altering the balance between, our individual liberties online and state power. So I'm I'm not saying that I'm not arguing that there should be no rules online. It should not be the wild wild west. I'm suggesting, and I'm not suggesting that platforms shouldn't have any accountability or they shouldn't have to deal with genuinely harmful illegal content. Um, but what I am saying is that the DSA, or the Digital Services Act, as it currently stands, it represents a serious threat to individual fundamental freedoms. Um, and it represents this threat by creating infrastructure for mass censorship. It's handed governments way too many powerful tools for authoritarian control over the internet, and it's established surveillance systems that monitor everything that occurs online at a global scale. Um, so the question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of internet do we want? Do we want one that's controlled or sanitized by governments, or do we want a free, open internet where diverse ideas are shared and controversial topics are debated, and where people can express themselves without fear of, arbitrary censorship? Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.